Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of AAF's Thought Leadership Series. I'm Lorraine Colte Vasquez, Executive Vice President of Multicultural Markets at AARP. And we're coming to you live from AARP's studio in Washington, D.C. AARP is proud to partner with the American Advertising Federation in today's intelligence panel, A Boomer's Perspective on Multicultural Brand Messaging and Media Content. I'd like to start with a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, Draft FCB, Leo Burnett, McCann, World Group, Omnicon Group, and RPA. We're truly grateful for your support. And a sincere thanks to all of you in the audience and our satellite audience and our host sites, DGB Latina in Miami, RPA in Los Angeles, Fitzgerald and Company in Atlanta, Columbia College in Chicago, and CNN in New York. We have assembled an amazing panel of experts who will share their research and insights about America's most important and fastest growing demographics. They will reintroduce you to the boomer cohort and let you know the secret is why some people refer to this generation as the golden boomers. So let's jump right in and have our panel introduce themselves. Emilio.
Thank you, Lorraine. My name is Emilio Pardo. I am the Chief Brand Officer for AARP.
Hello, my name is Sharon Pinello. I'm a strategist at McCann Erickson, New York, where our team focuses mostly on social media for big brands such as MasterCard, American Airlines, and Kohl's. I'm also a first-generation Filipino-American who grew up in Germany and the Deep South, so looking at the way culture shifts around the world is a big passion of mine, so I'm very excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Stephen Hirsch. I'm a strategist at Leo Burnett Company in Chicago.
Good afternoon, I'm Jim Lucas. I work at Draft FCB where I do work globally on retail strategy and insight, so very much interested in how shoppers think about things and behave.
Hi, I'm Marta Insua. I'm Miami-based with Alma DDB, part of DDB Latina. As you can all tell, I'm a foreign-born person from Argentina, living in Miami for a long time.
Hi, my name is Doug Harris. I'm the CEO of Kaleidoscope Group, which is a full-service diversity and inclusion consulting firm headquartered in Chicago. Do a lot of work in all areas of diversity and very excited to be here.
Hi, my name is Chuck Schroeder, Senior Creative People. I'm a copywriter and partner. Our group was formed from art directors and copywriters from the Doyle Dane Bernbach creative team from the 1960s. I'm the eldest here today and very interested in what these experts have to say.
Well, Chuck, as our elder statesman, why don't we start with you and have you define boomers for us and also share with us what are some of the characteristics that distinguish this generation from others?
Well, I'd like to say that I'm the definition of a boomer, but I'm a couple of years too old. So I've been through the rite of passage, and one of the things that interests me as a creative person and as a senior is the way that the boomers are going to begin to understand what it means to be called a boomer or a senior. They're very familiar now with the term boomer. They may not be familiar with how the term senior rings in your ear as you get older. And sometimes that ring is not all that impressive and not all that pleasant. And one of the things that is, as I say, as a creative person, that I look to and watch very carefully is messaging. I've been in the advertising business a long time, and I'm very interested in the way marketers succeed and fail to address seniors appropriately in a language they understand and also with respect.
Thank you. You know what, I'm going to turn to you, Emilio, so that we can talk a little bit about messaging and language, because I think that will frame this whole conversation.
Well, you're absolutely right. Language is absolutely primordial when you're looking at a boomer population, but there are a couple of myths that we need to sort of level set here. The boomer is not a monolithic group, as all of us know, right? There's the older boomer, and then there's a younger boomer. The 55-year-old today, which is considered the younger boomer, is dramatically different than the older boomer. But however, there is a constance throughout the entire generation, which is language. So we did a study a few months ago. We were struggling with what is the new language that we need to use in order to connect, to make that frame happen. And the study was called, when we're going into the study, the new language of aging. When we were done, it was the new language of living. Therein lies the shift of a boomer mentality. It is about living, not about aging. Doesn't mean that we're not about aging issues, but you're living through that frame. And if the marketeers and the communicators don't get the frame right, it doesn't matter how many tactics we use, the boomers are going to turn off. And that's the struggle that now lies in front of the population watching us. How do you frame it differently? And lastly, the boomers have changed the way they live life, right? I mean, they came on to age, and adolescence category was really put in place by the boomer generation as they became of age. Well, there's a whole new life stage forming, somewhere between working and this thing called retirement. Boomers either can't retire, don't want to retire, or retire but are still working. And what is that middle stage, and what is that language? And it's that curve that is not the upside down U curve that we're probably familiar with, the way you live your life. And you get to your retirement age, you get the gold watch, and then you go retire and you expire. Now, right about 48, 49 years old, there's that question, what's next? What do I do now? And boomers are right on that upward curve, and then it dips down until the end. But is that S line across curve not an upside down U? If you're a marketeer and you're marketing to the old frame, you will not get the hearts, and in this case, the wallets of the boomer population.
Very interesting point. So you started talking about segments, and one of the things is that people do start thinking of boomers in this monolithic way. I would ask you, Doug, and also Martha, please feel free to chime in, but this whole notion of diversity, inclusion, multicultural, and all of those words that people use interchangeably, and sometimes they may not be. So I would love to hear your perspective on that aspect of the market.
Thank you. A couple of things come to mind. It's interesting, too. I was just listening to Emilio and thinking about the power of boomers. And so there's been language around aging for a long time. But once we start to age, we can change the language. It's very dynamic how it's a powerful group.
It's a pioneering aspect.
Pioneering element of who we are. And those changes have been taking place throughout our lives. When we get there, it's like, let's look at it a new way. And so that's a powerful component of boomers. But I think when you look at diversity and boomers, it's important that we look at it as a slice of who people are. And so for myself, I look at the word identity. So diversity means difference. And then identity means you pull out the differences that are important to you, which say who you are. So you start to rank them either consciously or unconsciously. So for me, ethnicity still is maybe at a higher level of importance than generation. But that's just me. It doesn't mean that's for everyone. And so when we start to look at this term of diversity, we mean many dimensions, but how do people lean into them? We have different ways of seeing the world. So, but if you disrespect any part of our identity, that's an issue. You see what I'm saying? So it may not be my main one, but if I hear something, if someone asks me, are you going to retire? I'm like, hey, I'm not ready yet. So, you can still have some feelings in that arena. And then I think when we look at culture, it's becoming that more all-encompassing word that allows all the parts of us to be in existence and be recognized. So it doesn't cut us up as much, but we're just a holistic form. And so I think language is important, like diversity and multiculturalism, but I think it's also important to understand us as individuals.
Right, and talking about this growing explosion of Latino market, and
Yes.
you've been in that arena, Martha.
Yeah, talking about language, precisely. And a different kind of language, although it's not the ruling thing. I totally agree with that. It is a more of a layered kind of identity. And we're all in agreement that boomers are not monolithic. And among those diverse layers, here we are. I mean, the ethnicities, the minorities, the subsegments, or the subcultures. And the Hispanics are very much a part of that, although in this particular case, in the boomers' case, we are not the biggest minority, and we are not, ours is a very young population pyramid,
Yes.
both in the States and in other Latino countries.
So talking about this young pyramid and this age stratification, Sharon, I would love to ask you both, as you described yourself as a first generation of Filipino, and so bringing that dimension in, as well as this whole notion of a communication channel, because we've talked about language. Okay, so we know that the language has to be different, but then we also have to communicate in a very different channels. I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, our focus is on social media. So when we look at different generations, we know that the younger generations are driving a lot of the social activity that gets the big headlines, like Facebook, and people are tweeting. But I also think that boomers are not far behind in their adoption curve. They're also joining the same social media platforms. I love thinking about Steve Jobs as a reference point because he was a boomer. And because his vision of technology was really rooted in arts and humanities, and that it really became this really special thing because of that perspective. It wasn't just about the technology. He learned calligraphy from a monk and used that to inform how he built the first Mac. And I think that's really amazing. I think that if you're a brand or a marketer, yes, the boomer generation is not as social, but I think that there's a lot of opportunities for what they do use. So we do know that boomers use email primarily, followed by search. So Google is doing a lot of great work in this area. If you've heard of ZMOT, which is their zero moment of truth, this is connected to the idea that boomers really love researching stuff before they buy it. So those strategies work really well. I do have one more thought on the area of kind of what boomers want to share about themselves online. What we've observed is that younger generations want to share personal thoughts and feelings, right? But the boomers aren't going to do that. But I do think they share stuff when it's really important. So if you look at a network like patientslikeme.com, which is healthcare, you're actually sharing data about your biometric data, about any conditions you might have, very personal stuff, right? But when you know that your data is going to be aggregated with other people who might have the same condition, and they will help researchers come up with better cures for whatever condition you have, those are opportunities where they feel that their privacy is not being invaded. And that's a different kind of social network, a different kind of social sharing.
We're just touching on some of the characteristics that distinguish boomers from other generations. And I would love for any one of you to weigh in on that whole notion of what are those characteristics. Because I think, that we for me, when my data could be as part of an aggregate, that would be a fascinating thing, either Jim or talk about that, as well as some products.
A lot of great points made is sort of coming on the heels of this. One way to think about this, if you think about how the boomers have always been used to having a huge impact on things, a pig through the python metaphor that's been around for a long time. If you think about it, I think the boomers are people who sort of view themselves as involved in a cultural project. And that's a lifelong project, which is about creating the self. And so that changes over time. And the networks you talk to, the kinds of things you're interested in, are all things that change. And I think as a result of those two things, if you look at how they're approaching aging, they're going to be like, they're not going to fall into Demosthenes' mistake. And he was the person from Greek mythology who asked for eternal life, but not for eternal youth. And so I think for boomers, what you're going to see is they want to not just live long, but they want to live well. So I think if you think about those things, that's what their cultural project is that they're trying to work on going forward.
Yeah, so Steve, join in.
If I can add something, youth is so important to this audience. Boomers don't think of themselves in terms of anything else more so than youth. There's the wag who said the definition of youth today is if you're younger than Mick Jagger, you're young. And that's definitely how boomers think about themselves. They really are kind of a lens to look at what our culture is today, because we are a culture, we're coming into a presidential election, and we've got red America and blue America. And boomers were really there and making things happen when America sort of started dividing in that way. We had the hippie generation that said, we're rebelling against a lot of what's going on in this country. We want values that are less materialistic and so forth. We have different political views. And then there were other boomers who said, no, I'm more traditional. We still see that divide among boomers, and we see that divide playing out in the rest of the country. So they really are kind of, in a lot of ways, a symbol for what we think of as Americanness today. And I think that makes them a very vibrant force in America now.
You know,
Go ahead,
if I can pick up on Steve, let me hitchhike on the youth part of it. As a communicator, if you are programming towards boomers on age, you may miss the whole picture. And to your point, the average boomer, as we all know, let's say a 55-year-old boomer, it thinks itself or acts or behaves 10 to 15 years, depending on where you are in your life, younger. So if you're designing for a 55-year-old and you're designing for that age, you're going to miss it. You really need to be designing for somebody that is in a different mindset. And the second one is that boomers get accused of being brand loyal, and once they choose a brand, we're stuck. We're there, and you will miss it again. Boomers go for value. They do attach themselves to emotional connectors and relationships, but value is important. Make me look smart in order to do the we. So the shift that we're seeing is not just the me generation, it's we through me.
Right, right.
So it's that pathway that we need to keep in mind, and these myths have to be broken, and this panel is smashing them.
And the other myth, the other myth, I think, is that there's been these racial divides, and you've heard that through history, and yet if you look generationally, I don't know if it's mythology or if it's fact that those separations are being eliminated with the younger generation. Do you have anything, Doug or Marta, to add to that conversation?
We are not close to elimination yet, but I think they have been attenuated to a big extent. This is millennials and the ones younger than them are being raised and came of age in a very diverse world as compared to the baby boomers world. However, in the case of Hispanic boomers, let's say, which is sort of a weird thing to say, we never used that denomination, but Hispanic boomers, well, they have suffered hyphenation as much as African Americans, although it can be a good badge of honor. It was also in our case because of language issues, jobs issues, even immigration issues. It was not a very strong sense of belonging sometimes. You have to have going back to double consciousness, for younger people, for millennials, Hispanic millennials, which we like to call fusionistas because they are the experts in fusion. It's about being 100% American and 100% Hispanic. There's no conflict there and no problems with math either. But for the older ones, for the baby booming ones, it's been a very long road and a very hard one, and we pretty much hope that inclusion includes us.
Yes, I agree. I think that I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, the inner city of Hartford. Then I went to a prep high school. So my junior high school, 7th and 8th grade, we had 1,300 kids. We had 9 white students. I never seen them, but they said they were there somewhere. But, but it was primarily an inner city school. Then my prep school had 858 black students. Then I went to Tufts University, Procter & Gamble. Then I went to the Army as an enlisted soldier. And so what I see is real common purpose and common values, but unfortunately different experiences. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? So when I was with my prep school buddies, very different levels of wealth, but we had different common concepts of success, but what we were going through daily to get there was very different. So we were connected, but sometimes when I would explain the disconnect, they'd be like, I don't see that, Doug, I said, no, you gotta listen. I'll tell you all about it if you listen. So, and I think this is not just in the ethnic place, but on many elements of difference. We need to just understand there's a different experience people are having. And not wanting much more. We don't want special treatment. We just want access and opportunity to the same things, but the experiences become different. Yeah.
So then in terms of marketing and advertising, how is it that you build, and also in terms of language, Emilio, how is it that you build in those differences, and what are your strategies to make sure that they're impactful?
Well, I think in marketing, especially think about products and how that sort of plays out in the store all the way through, is one of the things is that we don't want to confuse segmentation with segregation. So if you think about it, on one level, you probably don't want to have those products classified as for aged people, right? So if you're going to want to track boomers or anyone, you're going to want to make sure that it has a sort of a multi-age audience. So it might be more along the way of interest if you're trying to sort of target things. And we've seen the same thing to be true of other products. You think about, like, if you're doing products that are targeted to African Americans or Hispanics, you want to be very careful that you're not communicating something else that's separate but equal inside the store, right? Which is always a kind of a problem. And we've also seen the same thing with products targeted to males. So what we're starting to see is, we need to come to a more, almost multicultural approach to how we're going to do marketing in the first place. So plays all the way through, I think.
Every human being has multiple identities. Nobody sees anything funny about being a son at the same time that you're a father, at the same time that you're a husband. And the same is true, as we've been talking about, with people's identities, whether it's cultural or ethnic or whatever. And so representing different kinds of people in advertising is one approach, but getting deep and finding commonalities, finding human truths that really apply to everybody is really a powerful way to go. I remember working for some time on 7-Up International. We developed an advertising campaign that we developed by finding common ground among radically different cultures. We went to Argentina, we went to the Philippines, we went to London, we went to Saudi Arabia, and we found a cartoon character that, pardon?
Fido.
You remember. Fido was unforgettable, right?
You've been to Argentina, didn't you say that?
Yeah, but I think we had a problem because people liked our posters so much that they were stealing them, and they were flooding the switchboard at Leo Burnett, asking for copies of the posters. We found something about human nature that really rang true wherever you were, and that's really kind of the magic. If you can really speak to folks and everybody feels heard, then you've bridged the divide.
So, how does this? I was going to say, how does this turn into this new life cycle, and how do we sort of bring that information forth so that it can inform how we market to these boomers?
Take Stephen's point of view here about celebrating sort of the commonalities, but it's also celebrating the differences.
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing in the marketplace, and it's a challenge for marketeers and for communicators. But there's an emerging aspect that ties to your social media that if you can add an ingredient to the communications process. So right now we have many companies dealing with social graph of your life, right? Mm-hmm. People like Facebook. Then you have interest graph companies like skiing.com or Groupon that are putting both of those together. With boomers, if you can add the purpose graph to that equation, now all of a sudden it's not about age, but it is closer to where you're talking about what is my experience. Yes. And boomers are looking for that meaning and purpose. Don't tell them you're going to help them find it because they're not going to like that, but it's there. And those companies and those advertising agencies that can bring the purpose graph and the meaning graph with your interest and your social, I think will find a new audience for the products and also for the communications process.
And I would say that I understand what you're saying, but in the case of what you might call Fido, I don't know how we called it, Fido Dido. In that case, it was a very interesting campaign that was based on things that were relevant in very different environments, but all of them were what we would now call general market in the respective countries. And that's a big difference. I mean, you can fine tune, but you still would be talking to one single audience in a way. In this country, I believe we might agree that respecting the differences and mostly bringing up relevant experiences that make people. We are all in agreement that this is about the life stage of boomers in America, as it is about the life stage of senior citizens all over the Latin American countries and Spain, let's say. But here, the minorities are not necessarily meaningfully addressed by a one-size-fits-all. And I understand the complexity of, and we shouldn't go to the segregation, but we shouldn't go to the wash down either.
And what
Go ahead,
happens is
Chuck,
oh, I'm sorry.
what I would love to do is to ask you to sort of jump in on this, but also this whole notion, see, from a boomer's perspective, this whole notion of speaking to a multicultural, multi-generational boomer.
Well, this conversation between you and me
Yes.
started with me touching you on the arm.
Right.
You and I are having a conversation.
Right.
I was taught advertising by a man who said that if you want to talk to somebody, have a conversation with them. Look them in the eye, express your views, and most important, listen to what they have to say. And that's what makes great advertising. I quoted Franklin earlier today, who summed up this whole process in one word, RESPCT. And that's really what this is all about.
Word.
That wasn't Ben, it was Aretha. And that's what this conversation is all about. If you show respect, first of all, you're going to open that channel of communication. We're going to have a conversation, and that conversation can be had with anyone. Everybody has to be treated like an individual and spoken to with respect like another human being. It's tough, because we're all tribal. We come from evolution, right? We have to evolve past our wired self, our DNA. And that's what's going to make us able to respect one another, as opposed to, well, you have an accent, so you must be different than I am and not quite as good. That has to disappear.
I think that's a key distinction, which is difference does not mean good, better, or worse. I mean, and so the difference is just difference. But I want to go back to Sharon, because I'm sorry, go ahead.
Jump in real quick,
Good, Doug.
because I love what was brought up by Stephen around commonality. And one of the things for people who have been historically excluded, the road to commonality is valuing differences. So the road to commonality doesn't come from finding commonality. It comes from understanding my uniqueness. Then I'm like, you're my guy. You see what I'm saying? So we look for this point of connection versus appreciating the points of disconnection. And in advertising, it's an interesting dynamic, because the other thing that takes place is that the research around advertising is extremely diverse. But then sometimes it comes into a pocket where the people making a decision around it is not. So all this great info, and then you get everybody in the room, and it's like they still come out with something that's missing the mark. So you got to have it inside as you get this information outside, and then bring those two together, and you have beautiful marketing. Quick story, my wife and I driving down the road, and there's a Nike poster, and it's a boy playing basketball against a little girl. So I look at the poster, I'm like, oh, nice poster. My wife said, wow. I said, what, man? That's a boy playing against a girl. I never seen a boy playing against a girl. Now, for me, it's just another poster, right? How many things we see is just another poster while somebody else is going, wow.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And we need to find the wow, because I like the poster, but I didn't like it like my wife. I had to buy 9 pair of Nikes after that, you know what I'm saying? So the reality is that there's different points of connection that if you need to diversify this thing, and that difference becomes the way of bringing that commonality together.
And don't we have the tools today to bring people something customized for them the way we never could before? It's the long-tail society. You don't have to do one commercial for everybody. You can have so many different pieces of communication. And Chuck, you said a conversation. Well, now we could literally have a conversation. In the old days, we used to talk about advertise as if you're having a personal conversation. Now we can literally talk back and forth real time with our consumers.
Right, right. I would jump in on this, because this social media phenomena, everybody keeps thinking that it is really a younger generation, and we know that how boomers are over-indexing in it as a form. So I would just love to have you talk a little bit more about that and the distinctions and its usage, you know, in the groups.
They completely are jumping. We had a really interesting experience at our agency just last month that will illustrate this. It was around the Trayvon Martin killing, which was the young 17-year-old boy in Florida who was unarmed and shot, et cetera. So when the shooter was not prosecuted, we actually held an event in New York at Union Square, and what we did was we created a Facebook event and a website to just ask people to wear a hoodie. He was wearing a hoodie at the time of his death, which made him look suspicious. So we said, let's get some people to speak out against racial profiling, upload a picture of yourself wearing a hoodie, post it to the internet, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. We didn't quite know what to expect, but what happened next was we started getting photos from people, young, old, people from all across the US, people from around the world. A lot of them were mothers, a lot of them were grandmothers posing in hoodies with their children. It was just an amazing experience to see how social media now provides a wider spectrum of engagement, I think, for more people to show support for a cause or to kind of break down these barriers that we were talking about before. And when I mean spectrum of engagement, I mean that we had an online component where it's very easy for people to do it. Some people are not happy that it's so easy to do it. But we also had this offline component where if you felt really strongly, you could come to Union Square in New York in person. And again, we saw people of all ages, and it really surprised us because we thought that the only people might be younger people. But I think social media is we're just seeing the beginning of this unpredictability of who's going to get engaged to a message that resonates across generations.
There's an interesting thing that you just said there, Sharon, and anyone could weigh in on this, is that this whole notion, and it goes back to your conversation about touching, that people are looking for, because everybody's saying that social media will make you more isolated and have you disengage and not have the personal connection. But you talked about this opportunity to create both that in-person kind of gathering and opportunity, but at the same time, this online. And so that is a new phenomena for us in this world, and it's also a new phenomena for boomers. And so it'd be interesting to see how that is going to affect how we communicate and how we present products and services. Emilio.
Well, just to piggyback on a few of the comments here, don't be afraid of doing a multi-generational approach in your communications and feel like you're going to alienate the boomer population. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Right. We've never seen the connection so strong between the boomer population, for instance, and the millennials, yes. Which is enormous. But I think social media, to Stephen's point, it opens up an entire way of coming of age into the boomer conversation, which is peer-to-peer. Boomers don't trust a lot of people other than the peer-to-peer, right? But in many ways, that peer-to-peer check-in is valuable to whatever brand you're trying to peddle into the marketplace. Because they're going to check in with their peers now in ways that we have never seen before they make that purchase decision, which is part of the DNA unraveling of their brand loyal to a point. But that peer-to-peer that we're talking about is huge. Don't be afraid of making it intergenerational.
The other thing you run into is that people will get turned off by the medium if they experience something negative in the medium. So I've talked to boomers and they say, did this person said this on Facebook? I'll never use Facebook again. I'm like, hold it. That was just a bad person saying a bad thing. But they'll turn the whole medium off because it's not about the medium for baby boom. It's about the message.
Yes,
You see what I'm saying? So the message can go through any medium, but when it's negative, I know my wife was, let me stop talking about my wife, but she just, cut it down. I don't want it. They'll turn the whole process off. And I'll be like, well, you can do this with it. You can do that with it. But they see these bad examples. So the element of quality, no matter what the medium is, I think is a foundation for how we see the world. And we're open to different mediums if it's connected with the quality component.
But why then do most advertisers still ignore the 49 plus or the 40 plus in the marketplace? What's going on?
Because advertisers created the youth generation. The advertisers, and guilty, I was there. Advertisers established this level of obsession that boomers have with young people, because boomers are young people. It was easy, right? So now, after being indoctrinated, after being part of a society that changed things dramatically, the 60s were pretty exciting, I would have to say, and frightening, and all of the other stuff that went together. Now they're hitting, the first of them hit 65 this year. How do you take somebody who's been told that young is the only thing to be all their lives, and now say to them, you're not that young anymore? So you have people who deny the reality. A friend of mine who will not take a senior ticket at the movies, will buy an adult ticket because she says, I don't want to watch that freaking movie depressed. That's what we have to change. This whole idea of the hoodie, yes, the language, and the whole idea of taking these symbols, these terms, and exposing them to the marketplace in the world, and saying that does not work. That does not work anymore. Here's a grandmother in a hoodie. What are you going to do? You going to arrest her? So the more we do all of this, you know, Jim and I are wearing our hoodies. You know, we got gray hair. We all have our hoodies. So we have to take the edge, the meanness, and the discriminatory side of these things off these terms.
And I think that social media is going to play a huge role, to your point, as marketers start to discover this. I think sort of the first discovery of this, is at least from research I've done it, as well as personal experiences, is if you think about it, connecting with your children when they're in college, which is impossible to connect with them on the phone or with email, right, leaves you with things like text and Twitter and Facebook. What has started to happen is you think about that sort of your initial toe in the water, and what's happened as a result of that is you're starting to see, and I think we'll continue to see, that social media is going to be a way in which boomers are going to explore what their options are as they go forward into the future. So I think as you start to see it, to your point earlier, Emilio, I think it's an emerging media for boomers because they haven't quite gotten comfortable with all the things yet, and we still ask a lot of questions like, what does this do again, right? But I think as people start to understand what the potential of it is, it's going to be a very important tool, and I think it'll be an important tool for marketers because it allows you to listen, which you were both saying earlier, as to a conversation and hear what consumers are saying. So I think in that sense, it helps you get back to all those things you're talking about in a conversation about being able to communicate with boomers in the way they want to be communicated.
Yeah.
What's amazing to me is that I find this, so we have two boomer generations, right, in my home. My mother lives with me, and she's taught me how to Skype, right, because she has the time to learn it, and I don't. But it is interesting how she has become a lot more adaptable to some of these channels than I have. But it is the way that we do communicate with this extended family that now lives.
And that is critical for our market, for Hispanics all over the planet, because the essential purpose of the social media is to stay in touch with those that really live far away, either within this country or somewhere else. It is more about convenience and the ability not to feel isolated and not to feel not in contact with those we love or want to know about. But in our culture, it is also very, very important to feel the presence of the offline relations and the network. I mean, we are social networkers. Hispanics are very promiscuous people who have always been very, without testing.
She means that in a very broad sense.
I know.
Yeah, she has. I don't think she meant it in a very narrow sense.
No.
In terms of Hispanics,
Boys will be boys, but
or girls. And so anyway, what I would love to do, I mean, because I do think, but I think there is this concern, all right? There is this whole concern using these new mediums in terms of privacy, Sharon. I mean, you alluded to it before. The concern that we have is that how much do you reveal, and then how much are you protected? And so it'll be interesting to hear your perspectives on that. And then I'm going to ask you one more question. Go ahead.
Well, like I said before, I think the generations just have different things that they consider are private. So for younger generations, to live stream my entire life to everyone with my personal life and details, mixing my personal and professional life may not be such a big deal. But again, we have all types of data, like again, medical data, personal data, emotional data. And I think in the end, it's really about the value exchange. Younger generations now will give all my email addresses, contact information for a coupon, right, or a discount, because that's my value exchange. I think brands need to come up with more compelling value exchanges if they want the data. Like they have to create the story about, if we learn more about you, we will stop spamming you with really bad ads, and you'll get kind of the valuable products that you've been looking for. And I think that's kind of the ideal we're all trying to look towards. I think that we hear a lot about, boomers saying they're not being marketed to. I really think institutions like the AARP actually has to educate us, the agencies and brands who market, on how we can better reach you. If you listen to the way marketers today like to talk about brand, it's about utility, right? It's about apps, it's about things that boomers actually do value. I just feel like there's a point there, but I feel like you have to educate us and say all these brand utility is actually making your life better. It's giving you the better price on things that you actually want and not bothering you with kind of ads that you don't.
It's that personalization also.
Well, and then,
Yeah.
then
Right.
you guys have to stop marketing to us by age.
Yeah.
And classifying us by age. You walk into a room, it's not, oh, there's Emilio, he's 50 years old. It's a personality issue that also, and it's a long-term process, but you can't ignore the market. The market, if you ignore that market as any marketeer or any brand, is at your own peril.
Yeah,
Absolutely. There's a natural force that's going to be a gravitational pull drawing marketing toward boomers, and it's really two little things. And those are the $2 trillion plus
Plus
To the
boomers.
room, yes.
that boomers spend. And the fact is, boomers are, in a lot of ways, the easiest generation to reach because
Yeah.
boomers still
So
read
true.
newspapers,
So true.
still listen to the radio,
Love TV.
television. It's really a rainbow of media that boomers consume, and certainly they use social media differently, not as much, use them in a different way, but that's
Utilitarian.
evolving. Utilitarian.
Get
but-
in, get out. I know what I want.
Well, yeah.
know.
Well,
But
but
as
purpose,
time goes
purpose
on-
also
Purpose.
kicks in, too.
Well, I know
Yeah,
what
I
I
think
want
purpose
once
is
I
huge.
search
Huge.
for it, and once
Research
and I
and
get my
yes.
peers' opinion on it. So it's
Yeah.
not so much I know what I want; it's sort of I know what I want, and then I'll know what I want.
Yeah. And it's very research based. We conducted very recently qualitative interviews with car buying intenders, Hispanics, mostly Spanish dominant from all over the country. And they would research in the myriad sites that could provide information about comparison between cars, as long as or up to the moment when they were asked for personal information. And these were not only boomers. There were a lot of 30-somethings over there. It is a cultural thing, I don't know. It's just something to take into account. Utilitarian has its limits when sometimes it collides with some cultural aspects.
The other thought that's coming to mind, I was reading something around, and it's going back to the point of purpose, about how boomers who had kids in the war, like about 95% of them learned how to use Skype. None of them knew anything about Skype, but it was a way to see their kid at war.
Right.
So it's like purpose over the vehicle. So, people come here, let's Skype. Skype for what? What am I Skyping for? You're right here, I can see you. Right, but when they go to war, so now I got a purpose to use technology. So I think when we come to boomers, we come with the vehicle. And the vehicle isn't exciting.
Yeah, right.
I ain't gonna tweet what? What am I gonna tweet? But give me a purpose. I'll tweet all day. And I think that the reason why they miss our market is they don't come purpose first. They come vehicle first.
Very well said.
And I think many times that helps or hinders, I should say, the success in connecting to us.
I think that's also related to the point earlier making about private information. There are two reasons why boomers are suspicious of that. One, of course, is the big brother thing that sort of went all the way through a lot of their lives. But I think a second one is they're saying, if I give you this information, well, what am I getting for it? And what they've seen in so many cases, if you look at how most of the old loyalty programs were built in the 90s, you're saying, it's not worth it. Juice isn't worth the squeeze in terms of what I get out of it. So I think what we're seeing is an entire, until they start to get there through some of this iterative stuff in the social media, leveraging it, I think they'll happily start to exchange it there, but the value has to be seen.
Right.
And it goes back to your purpose point.
Yeah,
Right.
that's
Right.
what you're saying.
Yes, you have the right purpose. The message is the message.
Yes.
I would love, I'm going to go back to you always, Chuck, as the elder statesman, all right? And for you, because I think there's been a lot of discussion on privacy, and I think, we've talked about it from a value perspective. We talked about it, whether it's purpose that's going to drive it, and how much of your privacy are you going to give up? But is there a concern? Is there a distinction within the boomer population in terms of how much of that privacy and the fear of how that information is going to be used? Is there a distinction between the boomers and let's say some other younger cohorts?
It kind of rides on the latest hacker news. Millennials, boomers, everybody in between hears a piece on the network news, reads a piece in the paper about some kid in Russia who's figured out how to hack into the Defense Department. If you can get into the Defense Department's mainframes, you can get into the cloud. So when you start thinking about that, and I've been involved in technology for 30 years. I had the first Mac, the very first one with the signatures on the inside of the case. And that's what passes through my mind and passes through people a lot younger than I am in terms of the safety of information. And the other interesting thing is, one of the things that a person my age reacts to is seeing 4 young people sitting around a table at a restaurant texting. One of the things that Marta talked about was the fact that Latinos communicate. They're big with communicating and talking to one another. If you're doing this all the time, you're losing your social skills. You're not gaining them. You're usually using a social mechanism, but you're losing your social skills. And that's something that somebody my age looks at very carefully. So I think this is all going to kind of evolve and roll. All of your personal life is not mixed with your business life, because now you have to censor it. Because employers are looking at you on Facebook saying, what's she up to? And that's not comfortable. Nobody's comfortable with that. So,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The other powerful thing, Chuck, is the word friends. For baby boomers versus others. So, I mean, their goal is to get as many friends as they can.
Right.
And then my father, like, you got 2 good friends, you're in good shape.
Right.
All you need is 2.
Hang on to them.
Hang on to them. And the word friends is being used, and even how they define friends differently from maybe how a boomer defined friends, and that social connection is different. So LinkedIn, for example, it's I love LinkedIn. I'm not a Facebook guy. But I'll link in. That just feels better. I'll link into 1 million people. Yeah. You know, but just to say, do you friend me? I'm like, well, who is this guy? Where do I know him from? No. So, but I don't feel that with LinkedIn. The person could be just as unknown. You see what I'm saying? But on LinkedIn, it's easier to just say, okay, no problem. You might be a good person to know. So I think that word friend and how we look at it versus how other looks. And when I talk to my children, we've had some dynamic discussions around the word. You know, just what it means and how I see it. And there's no right or wrong, but it's very distinct. It's like, this is somebody I know. Okay, well, call them that. They say, no, they're my friend. I'm like, okay, all right. That's your way.
You've got to weigh in on this language conversation because it really is at the core. Steve, please do also, because I think it is at the core of the distinction between the millenniums and the boomers.
Well, I mean,
forget about the Gen Xers. That's a generation all onto its
as the panel here, these are the experts in creating language into imagery, but you know, it's also behavior. I think you were talking about, and Chuck, the boomers are getting on the technology efficiency because they want to be effective. They want to accomplish things, versus perhaps others that are looking more from an entertainment perspective or, you know, a social. But language matters not just in the purchasing behavior, but in connecting with the heart as well as the wallet. And the boomers have been marketed to since Mr. Potato Head and the Slinky, which were the first, you know, kick on, you know, for mass marketing. If we are experts at finding out whether you are trying to sell me something, meaning boomers, or not, we know how to sift through media. I think social media can be a humongous connector and a leveler of language with the boomers, if you do it from a point of view of efficiency, accomplishment, happiness, help me make things better for not just myself, but for my family. So family, you know, it's all about language. By the way, boomers don't like experts. They want to have a coach or a mentor, right? Yes, the concept of language is now been transformed by not just this generation, but the Gen Xers coming right behind us. And we'll miss it. I mean, old, senior, retired are now very popular words. The big word, retirement. How many definitions of retirement we have today?
And there's
you know,
no
if I wasn't
good
surfing,
word for
right? If I wasn't surfing
Spanish.
at 30, why would I want to surf at 50 and see myself in a television? That's not relevant to me. So 50 is the new 50. You know, I was accused of the 50 is the new 30, so I apologize about that. But 50 is the new 50. And that kind of language, I'm not done yet, is critical phrases that boomers will resonate with you, but they know when there's a gimmick coming. So we got to be very careful with the medium as well, not just the message.
Well, that's absolutely true, Emilio. And boomers tend to see a gimmick when you talk to them about a smartphone. Boomers are far less likely to use a smartphone. I work on the Sprint wireless account, so I know a little bit about this.
Interesting.
And we've been talking about how boomers use social media differently. Well, getting on Facebook has changed for younger people because you have your smartphone with you all over the place and you can connect with people anytime via social media. And boomers are much more likely to say, smartphone to connect to the internet all the time, I don't see it. And people think, well, it's not going to happen. Well, the United States used to use very little in the way of text messaging. Europe was ahead, and we said, well, I guess it's just not a thing for the United States. Well, it came later because people discovered it. We didn't have as much economic pressure to use it because pricing over there in Europe made it much more advantageous to use text messaging, so they got it first. But we figured it out. Boomers are going to figure out the value of having the smartphone, and a lot of the behaviors will be pulled along then because it's with you all the time and you can use it.
And we have to remember the mutual influence that always existed and exists between boomers and millennials, and the echo boomer original denomination by Yankelovich. I mean, we are mutually learning from each other or coaching each other. So our children will teach us how to do the thing of passing to mobile or smartphones as a privileged way of accessing the internet.
And
then we will.
That's the consistent
Right.
with us as human beings.
Yes.
We have, for 1,000 generations, taught the younger how to do things, so when they get a little bit older, they're going to teach the younger, and it passes up through, and that's why we, thanks to our opposing thumb, have been able to develop the brain that we have now.
You know, that's a very powerful thing. If you extract what you're talking about, adaptation, in the boomer, the boomers have had to adapt to a gazillion changes, and now more than ever.
Yes.
So now all of the systems that we all grew up with, we can't trust them, or at least boomers can't trust them. And what is that navigational system that allows us to live our life in the best way we can? Adaptation in a changing world is a very powerful frame to introduce a service, a market, or a product. And I go back to help me live my best life, help me adapt, then I'll opt in. The concept of recruiting me for something is gone with boomers. They're opting in. Let me have the choice. And I do agree, Stephen, on the concept of the early and later adopters. But let's face it, boomers are buying more smart devices than anybody else in the marketplace. I mean, look at the sales of iPads and iPhones. 75% are 50 plus. Now, maybe they're buying it for somebody else in the household and themselves. But ignoring that wave will ignore your bottom line in the marketplace.
Apple doesn't advertise to seniors.
No.
I mean, most of that insight comes from our children sometimes.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, getting the iPad, like, I don't need that. Oh, yeah, here's what you can do. You can put all your bills on here. Well, really? Really? You can do all that? Next thing you know, you're going out. So it's a new positioning, same product, new positioning.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And that new positioning, it's like, that's that connection you were talking about earlier. This thing is good. Now, why it might be good for you, it'd be a little bit different why it's good for you, but it's a good thing, and we reposition.
So both Martha and Chuck both talked about this changing role, you know, like when you were once an influencer and now you're the one that's being influenced in this intergenerational aspect. I think that's going to be an important discussion because it's also going to be important because we're going to have a panel after this panel that's going to be a youth panel reacting to everything that you said. So this is your time to be an influencer and to also help shape that conversation. But it is interesting, Jim, when you start thinking about those distinct roles and how those are evolving. How is it that, you know, as a marketeer, and, you know, without being gimmicky, all right, knowing that who you are doing this for, how is it that you address that? Because it is about positioning the product in a very different way.
Well, I mean, I think one of the biggest things we said is something that Doug mentioned earlier, which was about it's now purpose over product feature is what we're seeing increasingly. And we've done a lot of work with neuroscience and eye tracking and all those kinds of things to see how people process things. And you realize that all these things happen in a fraction of a second. And so what we've seen is that you have the rise of visual literacy. I can do all this stuff without ever uttering more than 6 or 7 words. And I think if I can get to the heart of the matter, which is the benefit or the purpose, which is exactly what you described with your iPad example, that's a really good way to communicate with anyone, right? So that what's beautiful about that is, again, if you look at boomers, they're much more focused on the purpose or benefit of this product. So I think it becomes a way to sort of go after that without ever having to say, oh, we're going after a specific age group, or it's not so much focused on who is in, who you're picturing in the commercial.
And about not alienating any of both generational ends. Because if you believe that by focusing on millennials, you will be cooler, you might be wrong. I mean,
one of the other thoughts coming to mind as you're talking about even purpose with them. I know they had that body wash for the young people where you use it. 8 girls come running. I go in the bathroom. My son got like 8 bottles. I'm like, what's going on? The purpose was impressive.
Yeah,
so purpose is also for others. It's like it was body wash, maybe body wash, but that ad was great.
Yes.
Based on the purpose that it put out there. And so that, and then you look at that multiculturally. How does that work around purpose multiculturally? How do you get the right information to say, this is what would give that purpose for me? This is what would give that. And then have people assessing that through diverse eyes. I think we're on to something.
Well, one thing, just to follow up on your example about the body washes, what's interesting about that is the people who consume it are not the people who buy it. So the people who are buying that product are mothers of those young adolescents or young adults, right? And we're pretty sure that their mothers don't think that if they use this, they're going to get lucky. What they're saying is, I'm just so grateful that they're taking an interest in their personal hygiene, right? So if you think about how you're trying to get to the purpose, right? And say, again, you got different segments. So I think that's one of the ways we can sort of, address some of this messaging wise.
Right, you've never been cleaner, son.
Yeah, but I before we move on to sort of like a different area, I would really like Chuck to talk a little bit more, because it really, you made an interesting comment before when you're using the medium and saying, you do lose these like social abilities, and what is it that we can, sort of like impart, particularly because it is such a phenomena and it is such an influencer and an intergenerational aspect. This use of the 4 people at the dinner table, not talking to each other, but obviously connecting with someone else and not using that opportunity.
Maybe amongst themselves. It can happen. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's the value of storytelling, which in our business has always been, sometimes it's slipped into the background. The technology's forced it into the background because the tech doesn't have a story. It has a bing and a bang and a boom. So I think if you focus on the value of storytelling, again, I hate to keep going back to 10,000 years ago in our campfires, but we were telling each other stories. And that's how we shared information as cultures and as people, and it's how we evolved. So we have to, I think, reappreciate. Some never lost it. We have to reappreciate the value of the story.
I think this is an interesting. Go ahead, Emilio. Were you going to say something?
No, I think storytelling is a huge antidote for what we're talking about here, and we believe that it's across all generations.
Yes. Maybe
coming from different points of view. And I think that's the responsibility. There's a certain sense of responsibility and purpose and meaning from the generation of telling their story. And frankly, that they're not done telling the story yet or shaping it. So we have a few more years to go to finish that storytelling. It's a very powerful conversation to have if you have a product or a service that can connect to that.
There's storytelling and there's listening skills. I think that's something the boomers have to impart to the millennials. Sherry Turkle, the psychologist at MIT, spends a lot of time studying and writing about the relationship that we have with our technology. And she's observed that we put ourselves in a bubble when we forget basic manners. We're talking with somebody, we don't really engage in that conversation because we're looking at a device. We allow ourselves to be interrupted. We say, well, I'm talking to you, but there's something else that's more important, and it interrupts the flow of the conversation. It interrupts the story, it interrupts the experience of listening, and I think that is something that we can value as boomers and that we can impart to anyone else.
The other thing, Lori, too, that I'm curious why it hasn't come up in the panel yet, is the optimistic point of view of the boomer generation as it relates to that they can do better, despite the reckoning or the Great Recession, whichever way you want to call it. And in that Great Recession, that really tested the generation, especially the younger boomers. But you still saw huge optimism. And it's not about money. It's about I'm not done yet, and I know I can do better. And it's interesting because I think that patina of optimism will define the generation to come. So as advertisers and communicators, if you miss that and go towards the aging, not the living, then you're missing the market. And you're not going to the optimism of, I can still do this, even if you have a chronic condition.
Well, Amelia, that goes back to the ambition of this generation. The ambition is really something that characterizes boomers.
Yes.
And back in the 60s, some of us remember, we knew we could change the world.
Yes.
If you can change the world, and did.
So
But boomers
that's
are still
interesting because-
thinking they can, and we are still
Right.
changing the world. I mean, and that's the
Right, and if you
Go
go ahead.
The worst analogy, the Python analogy is interesting. I heard it described by a sort of a seniors expert on NBC who was saying the boomers are a bubble passing through a python. And I listened to that and I said, what happens at the other end? It's not a good kind of a picture to draw in somebody's mind, but the fact of the matter is that this, however you want to describe it, is going to change society. As boomers become older and begin to appreciate the fact and understand the fact that they are older, and that maybe they haven't treated older people all as well as they could have in their lives, our society, I think, is going to change because of that.
already, right?
Yes, it is. It is already. And this society is going to get a little bit closer to the Asian societies, the Latino culture, where seniors are not only respected, but in many cultures they're revered for what they know. I don't mean to run on here, but the tsunami, there was an island out there in Indonesia, and older folks saw the ocean going that way, and they said, we're out of here. All of us are out of here. And everybody's standing around going, what? And as a result, 8 or 10 people died on this island as opposed to thousands that could have died because the old folks knew what that meant.
So which brings us to an interesting phenomenon. This is the first time in society, other than when we were an agricultural society, where we have 3 generations, in the workplace, and work probably four now, right? Working towards a particular task, and also going back to this whole notion of the role of the boomer as sort of like this elder statesman and the sage. It'll be interesting to see how that will change the workplace or the impact that has on the workplace. I'd be curious to see from any of your perspectives what you view on that, and also from a multicultural perspective.
Yeah, no question. There's a term we use called generational synergy, which talks about there's a mindset from some that once they get older, they'll be like me, But they've grown up in different times and different exposure. They'll never really be like us because they've seen different things. We had 2 or 3 channels, and they all went off at 9 o'clock. They got 8 million channels. They're just exposed to so much that they got a different way of seeing the world. So how do you look at the word, and I think you brought up earlier, Chuck, is respect. And so we'll use the word respect, but then we say respect looks like this. And that's the error. The word is important, but the word has many different looks. You see what I'm saying? So my father, I tell him, I once asked my father, why should I do something? He said, I'm gonna give you one answer. This will last the rest of your life because I told you so. I never used the word why again. Today we're conversing. Hi, son. Oh, hi. We're having these long dialogues about cleaning the room. Those things didn't really take place too much when we were growing up. So it's still respect, but it looks different. And so I think that is something we have to wrestle with, because in the workplace, even how we looked at managers and bosses was different. How we believe that we had a term called pay your dues.
Yes.
It's just a different world
Yeah.
today, and we fight it,
Yes.
but it's just a reality.
Yes.
And how do we bring all those differences together to produce outcomes is a task many organizations are addressing.
But there's also the concept, though, the average 50-year-old today is looking at 20 to 25 years of work ahead of them.
Left, right.
To Lorraine's point about the mixture in the workplace, that is going to redefine what it means to not only work, but to your point earlier, when at the end of that other Python, we don't know. We've never been here before in America where we have 70-year-olds into retirement in the millions and millions and millions of generations.
Yes.
We've never really experienced that before, so we're entering a new territory.
Right.
And that is the responsibility, I think, of this. I love this energy that you're talking about with the generations.
Yes.
There's a burden going on that is not just for the millennials picking up the boomer, it's the other way around as well.
No doubt.
We have that responsibility.
And it's a
Yeah,
new,
but-
it's a new trend.
So, sorry. No, that we shouldn't forget that when Xers came into the labor force, it was easy because there were so many boomers and so little Xers. Now, we are facing another unparalleled situation.
We are.
2 generations with the same weight in terms of quantity and the same kind of energy as well. And so what's going to happen, because the pay your dues thing is not playing up, we both need each other, but it's also, I wouldn't say a power struggle, but where are you going to leave my place vacant? No? We have to face
Yeah,
that.
well, the Xers do not believe in pay your dues. They've come from a generation where they've seen what
That's
paying
right.
the results of paying your dues.
Right. Yes,
So
yes,
they've been the disappointed. They've seen all the disappointments of the parents and
Another
that
real
whole.
quick point, a trend in generations is that people are getting to maybe 60, 65, staying 15 more years, but I know an individual who was a CFO who's now a financial analyst.
Yes,
You see
that's
what I'm
the
saying?
point.
He ran all of finance. He said, I want to continue working, but I don't want this kind of pressure.
That's the
So he kept working,
Right.
but now he's a mentor. He's in a second level, entry level position when he was the top CFO. So when people stay, they either leave and do something they enjoy,
Right.
or they'll go into another place where I'm like, I don't want the CFO thing anymore. I don't want that level of pressure.
And that's what we're seeing in the
That's
marketplace
exactly
as that new life stage that
Yes.
we talked about
Right.
here earlier. And it's undefined yet, right? It's unnamed yet. But it also taps the purpose again.
Yes.
Because assume the 52-year-old that just lost their job as a machinist, that job will never come back. But they have to go to work. And they have to reimagine their gifts, their passions, their values to find work. So therein lies another shift in language, right? I mean, boomers, and especially the Gen Xers coming back, they're having to reimagine, not reinvent. That's another word that is too big for a boomer. That's
Right.
too big, it's too heavy.
Yes.
But reimagining means I have to go inside and figure this out. That conversation is going to be very interesting for marketeers to tap into. Because Google has it, LinkedIn's already onto it, and social media is leading the pack.
Yes, Chuck.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, just from my perspective, I never heard the term road trip before the 60s. You remember the road trip? Hey, where? Doesn't matter. And you're on the road, and sometimes you're on the road for days,
Right.
you know? And I think that when you come from that kind of an environment and a mindset, it really equips you especially to say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to take a new road. And so you have that flexibility built into you. My parents didn't have that. They couldn't do that. And there's a lot of pain loose out there in our society now because people can't find the new road. But it's there.
Yep.
It's there. We grew up with
boomers
it.
are looking for it.
Yes.
They're
So
searching.
that brings us to the question. So will they influence? I mean, will they still, kind of like keep being an influencer and changing the society? Because we're still talking about, they were the ones who started this whole societal shift. And here they have this opportunity. So how is it that we live into that new space?
I think there's two ways in which it can be influential. One is if you think about how many multi-generational households there are now, right? So it was the first sandwich generation where you could be paying to put your kids through college and paying for your nursing home for your parents, right? So you see that there's this that started to emerge. And we've also seen this start to extend where you're seeing a lot of people, about 60% of the boomers will say that they have one of their adult children living with them, and about half of them have their own children. Right, so you've already got the generational synergy, maybe more generational synergy than you want, right? But you know, it is there. I think there's a second part of that, though, as you start to think about how this starts to change what's going on. So it gives you a good way to start to have that contact between 2 or 3 generations in the same household. I think the second thing is that the shift from, you know, your children to go through college now have an Odyssey year, and I think that's almost what now the boomers are looking at when they come out of this, you know, their last job, is you're saying, well, what's my next Odyssey here? And I think, you know, there's a similarity inside there that's probably there's cross-influential things going on because of the multi-generations, but I think, you know, that's what we're going to see going out in the future, is a blending of those influences.
Yeah,
I think that blend is also redefining another word, work life. And boomers are moving towards life work, and where there's a blend of work, retirement, and living. And that life work journey, and I love your Odyssey moment. By the way, it's not cool to say midlife crisis, but midlife rally. Now we're talking. And so there you have the nuance of that optimism meets the Odyssey, that it's so powerful as a communicator in your side of the fence to try to connect with the boomers.
And millennials are starting off with life work.
Yes.
So we're trying to move to it. They're starting day one, life work. And we're like, what's wrong with you? You're not here that long, life work.
So,
You know, I mean, they're starting off with the life work mindset because they've seen things. It's like, I need to put something else as a priority.
Correct.
You know, and they're also dealing with a different turf. So when we came out of school, we're in a different time. I had like 11 job offers. I was sitting around like, oh, boy, where do I go? You know, our kids got to work 4 interns. You know, it's like they're competing with people my age for jobs. You see what I'm saying? They're in a very different marketplace.
Right.
And so they're looking at this thing like, wow, if I'm going to stay encouraged, I need to create some value in other places.
That's right.
Versus the workplace where that was our main place of creating our value.
So we're coming close to an end, and there's 2 questions. I want to direct my last question to you, Sharon, because given who our next panelists. But as the Executive Vice President for Multicultural, I want to go back to something that you said, Chuck, which is, I can't lose it, which is that we will start looking more like China. We will start acting more like Latin America in the terms of speaking to a multicultural, to a nation of distinctions and languages. And I'm sort of paraphrasing what you said. But you talked about the influences and speaking to a multicultural nation. I don't want to lose sight of that because I think that is really clear. So I would love for you to take 1 minute to sort of like amplify that and talk about the boomers as an influencer and help shaping that conversation.
Well, the upheavals in the 60s, the biggest upheavals were around civil rights. And when you're given a moment of revelation, like a kid who gets shot because he's wearing a hoodie, it's the same moment of revelation that you get when you see that the Army has to turn out and attack a university because a black kid is going to school. So I think when you come from that in your 20s, teens, whatever, you begin to look at how the society has to shape to get along with itself. I mean, we're all a society. We're all in the same boat together. And if we're going to get along together, we have to begin to understand what wearing the hoodie means and how it cuts a bunch of different ways, and isolate the bad ones and focus on the good ones. It just keeps you warm, buddy.
It was interesting that during that same time there was this whole advertising in, I think it was Vanity Fair, of hoodies for women, and I'm like, oh my God, look at the contrast in time here. And just changing a conversation. Well, but I wanted to go back to Sharon because we were talking about boomers as an influencer and this whole, you know, multi-generational workplace and homes, and sometimes much to our dismay. But do you think that boomers are really the influencers, or do you think it's the other way around? I mean, particularly we're going to have a panel that's going to react to everything that you said, so this is our opportunity to start having those discussions.
That's a tough one. I think it's both. You know, when I think about influence, I have to put my marketer hat on because we're obsessed with influence now, right, with social media. I think before, influence might have been what celebrity is going to influence whoever that you want to talk to, right? And now with social media, it's like, who are the influencers as evidenced by how many followers or friends or fans that they have, right? So people are very obsessed with that. Like, I think there's this myth about one influencer figure who makes a lot of people do what they want. But if you look at kind of the new thinking that's coming out of the guy who works at Google, he's now the user experience guy at Facebook. His name is Paul Adams. Great book called Grouped. And it's about this notion that everyone is an influencer in their areas of expertise, right? And I think that is kind of a concept that we should magnify. And I think in that case, you'll have the boomers with their expertise and millennials and ways that they influence who they're close to in their social networks. And I think that's kind of how the web is kind of evolving.
It's very important. It's like the word influence and the word power. They're distinct words, you know, and I think baby boomers have learned to be powerful even without influence. I'll find the influence to stay in power. So if you know something better than I do, I'm hiring you so I can still look good. It's a dynamic around. So the influence is in places where we're not influencing. You asked the question earlier, why aren't they targeting us? Because we're not really influencing many times. So that's how we're perceived by advertisers. We're more the power base. Like you said, I think we pay the check. But my son wants that body wash. I'm not into that. He's the influencer. And where is so how do we bring those two connections together will be very interesting.
You know, in our generation, we saw a lot of innovation, a lot of novelty coming from younger people, rock and roll, fashion, you know, rebellion, political demonstrations. It was sort of a youth movement. But Steve Jobs recently died, and he was a mature boomer who played a role not unlike Elvis in our society. So how old you are, where you come from, what culture you're from, it's become there's much more opportunity to be an influencer wherever you are, whoever you are. It's easier to get an audience, it's easier to get a microphone.
Boomers invented youth in a way, or defined it. As Chuck said. Now we are reinventing this other stage of life.
Right.
And even as Steve Jobs, it's interesting, is he a power player or an influencer? So once he got power, he got a whole bunch of smart people working for him. You see what I'm saying? He may have driven it with his vision.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying? From a power place, and still said, now let's make this vision happen. Let me get the minds around me that can really influence that real change that I see in my vision. So that's generational synergy to me. That's what, when I say generational synergy, let me do what I do, and if I could do what you do with you and we do it together, we're so powerful collectively versus thinking we're in different places.
Steve Jobs was a great storyteller.
Yes.
That's what he was.
That's you're right.
That's
No
what
question.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk to people inside Apple. When Steve told the story of why this thing had to do this thing in not 15 seconds, but 10 seconds.
Yes.
And he said, think about all the time it's going to save. Put all those 5 seconds together among all the people in the world. It's 100 years. That's how much they're going to save. That's a story. He was wonderful at that. And that's, you know, we tell and we listen to our stories, and that's what influence, I think, really boils down to, doesn't it? Is that overly simplistic
I agree.
at all?
Okay, so what are the channels in which what are the most effective channels in which to tell those stories for this generation?
It's interesting, and I think there are a couple of channels. I think email still ends up being a very powerful one. Okay, so we talked about, like, you know, how much time everybody spends, how much time we spend on our email. But I think we're starting to see the social stuff starting to emerge. So if you look at, you know, again, as you said, as boomers begin to understand this, probably largely at the tutelage of their own children or grandchildren in terms of, you know, who they're going to link in with or who they're going to, you know, talk to on Facebook or whatever. I think, you know, they will start to take on the social media a lot more, and I think that is where the big opportunity is going to be in the future, because again, it allows you to do that two-way street that you were talking about before, Amelia, which is like being able to listen to the boomers to understand how we need to talk to them.
Yeah, but some of the other mediums are very important, particularly if Google just came out with some study that it talked about the Hispanic market, and the Hispanic market needs to see it on television before they can search for it on the internet, and then when they see it in both places, it becomes a premium, trustable product for them. And so,
and right now, boomers spend a lot of time on their computer, on their desktop, but as you say, they're doing Google. They're doing a lot of email, Jim. But the marketer that can tell them the story and say, here's the purpose for Facebook, here's why you should get involved, is going to win some friendship there.
And I want to piggyback on that because I think its purpose meets innovation in the future. I mean, for us to think that we're not going to innovate the next interface, it's wrong. Look what's going on with smart televisions coming out now, where it's voice activated or motion activated.
I know, it freaks me out.
Well, we know, yeah, right. You know, that's an issue of convenience and an issue of accomplishment and efficiency. Boomers are going to go for that, just as much as the millennials are going to go at it from a different point of view of coolness. We're going to come at it, or boomers are going to come at it from, I don't have to worry about reprogramming that machine again. I just tell it what to do. And that is the functionality that you cannot miss as an engineer of new product experiences.
It's so amazing because when I first heard about that, and this is just a small anecdote, I remember thinking, oh my God, this was the first way I thought of television. Where are the little people, you know, inside that box? And it just threw me to that when I first started hearing about that new technology. We have a few minutes left, and I have Fran in mind letting me know how much more time we have. I would like to give you one opportunity because the next panel behind us is going to be this youth panel. And although we should not be trying to influence them, this is a good opportunity to spend just one moment and have everyone do sort of like a little round robin as to what's the message that we would want to come out of this conversation about the perspective of boomers and how we would like that to close this program. Okay, I'm going to start with you, Marta.
Okay. Well, I will borrow generational synergy from Doug.
$2, Mark.
You're cheap.
That was easy.
Doug,
But I mean, generational and multicultural synergy, but really inclusive. And I will rescue the concept of respecting the differences and understanding how enriching they are from a marketing perspective.
Doug.
Yeah. My son has a business inside of my business called Young Minds, and they do like multicultural and the marketing and the media and all of that. And it's just what I learned from him, and I think what he learns from me and his team, and what we learn from each other is just great. So generational synergy and just having I've learned today, just loving conversations with people who are different, you know, is just an empowering element. And that way you'll find those touch points of what really is valuable for people, so you can connect to them and advertise appropriately.
Right.
Optimism. You know, we were, I think, if you can attach a label or a perspective to us as boomers, it was optimism. And the great philosopher Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. And it ain't.
Right. Well, my contribution is going to be that there are multiple rights. And many rights make it even, you find the better right. And so that's one of the things that boomers also bring to the conversation, is that all of these views of right.
I'm going to go with hyper-relevance, because I think one of the key things we're starting to see in just about every one of these, and it's sort of behind what Emilio said initially, is if you think about it, like, how do I make sure that I'm going to communicate with people at the right place, the right time, with the right message? And I think, again, that sounds kind of trite, but what we're starting to see is, and go back to the purpose thing, is that things like mobile are starting to be thought of the same way as packaging or POS, where people are starting to say, this is something where I can use it immediately to make a decision. So the landscape's changing, and so I think there's a big need for hyper-relevance as we go forward, especially with the boomers.
Yeah, sort of, is that related to purpose, right?
Yes.
Yes. Good.
I think marketers can think in terms of marketing to each other. In the 90s, when the economy was going crazy, and as Doug talked about, there were job offers all over the place, it was hard to keep people in a company sometimes. And there was the concept of, you've got to market to people. You've got to make it clear to them how it's enriching, how it's a good experience to have this job, and that their contribution is valued. So recognizing the differences, who they are, where they're coming from, what they want, and making that, making the whole experience appealing, really creates a lot of synergy in the organization. And they should market back to you and show why they're valuable and why they're contributing, why it's a good experience to be working with them. If everybody works together like that, then you really have synergy.
I'm going to go with passion points over age demographics. I think that a good example is Weight Watchers, one of our clients. They have a website where you can find people by age or location, and there's some stuff going on there. But the Facebook page for Weight Watchers is actually much more engaging in terms of conversation. I think it's because there people are really just focused on the passion, which is trying to live a healthy lifestyle with what they eat. And so people are talking to each other there around what they're passionate about versus kind of what defines them by their demographics.
So we're going to go to the boomer expert. Amelia, we're going to
Well,
end there.
Well, I'm going to turn it around, and for the next panel is, don't think of the R word as retirement, but think of relevance. How can I be relevant to my generation? And if the next panel is looking at it, I would add two things to the brilliance of this panel is it's about language. And it's an optimistic point of view, but it is also about living your best life and trying to navigate language and the commonality of the multi-generational approach. And don't miss the fact that the wallet is also quite large in the generation.
Good statement. I want to thank you, each and every one of you. First I thought I was going to have to be a referee, given what we were going through in the green room, but it didn't turn out that way. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for participating. I would love to thank our sponsors, and hopefully that we will, as boomers on this panel, sans Sharon, we could really influence and really have changed this conversation and change the language by which people are talking to the boomers. And I'm be very curious as to see what the responders, who are much younger than we are, will have given our comments. Again, thank you all very much. And thank you, Florida, Atlanta, CNN in New York, and all those other places who have joined this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.